Set your course for the Hoth
Takes podcast.
Welcome back to Hoth Takes. I'm Eric Geller.
I'm Grace Seegers.
And I'm Haley Bird-Wilt.
And we're talking in this episode about the first 3 episodes of The Bad Batch. That's right, Lucasfilm's new animated series. Of course, we're going to dive into this. And I actually will say right off the bat, just overall, that I was more impressed by this, at least in the first 3 episodes, than I expected to be. Do you two share that view?
It's like comfort food. I love it. It's just fun to watch. And yes, I've been impressed by it, but it's also like, I don't know. I grew up watching the Clone Wars, and it's good to have something like this being produced again.
I like the animation a lot. I'm really impressed by the animation. And I wasn't a huge fan of the first episode, but the 2 subsequent episodes I have liked a lot more. So I am enjoying it more than I expected.
Yeah, there's no question that this is some of the best animation on television, full stop. And it's clear how much iteration they've done with the sort of the Clone Wars rendering engine. This is Lucasfilm animation at the top of their game in that sense. I thought we could start by talking about the Bad Batch themselves, because they are supposed to be the heart of the show. And, when I said I was more impressed than I expected, part of that is I don't particularly care about these characters. At least I didn't going into the show. And I've said several times, I am watching this show for the lore. It's part of why I watched The Mandalorian, and that show also did sort of a 180 and took us in an interesting direction, and I think we'll talk a little bit about how this show does the same thing. But I have to say, by the latest episode, they're starting to gel in an interesting way. There's a great sort of team spirit there that I'm actually getting into in a way that, I think a lot of this is D. Bradley Baker giving them different personalities, which is a tremendously challenging task, but I actually care a lot more about them than I expected to, and it's pretty early on, so I would say, shout out to Lucasfilm on that one.
Yeah, I would say I'm a little bit less enthusiastic than you are, Eric, re the Bad Batch themselves. I didn't really care about them prior to this show. I care about them slightly more now. I think a big part of that is because Lucasfilm has really cracked the formula of giving a cynical warrior an adorable, precocious child, and having that found family dynamic that is very apparent in the Bad Batch. So I like them the most when they as a unit are acting as the collective dads to Omega. And I already have residual affection for Echo from the Clone Wars, so I'd say I'm probably the most attached to him. But I like Hunter. I really like Wrecker. I do not care at all about Tech, and I actively dislike Crosshair. And did
Crosshair is such a creep. Why is his voice that way?
Yeah, he's so... Ugh. Anyway, so I went on too long, but they're fine. It's fine.
I like them. I've always struggled. This makes me a fake fan, but I was telling y'all earlier, I've always struggled with keeping up with the clones. So it's gonna take me probably the whole season to be able to remember their names, and I know Wrecker because my husband always calls him Thrasher, and I'm like, that's not it. But I think it's been like you said, Grace, it's most fun when they're like sort of grappling with this very sudden fatherhood. And like in the one that I watched most recently, where Wrecker makes this cute little bedroom for Omega, and
it's so cute.
It's adorable. It's just so wholesome. I think that dynamic is fun.
Yeah, I particularly like Hunter because it's clear that the responsibility for figuring out what to do with Omega is on him. And I like watching him have to take on this, again, like The Mandalorian, take on this new mission that he was not trained for and watch him try to improvise that. I would say I agree on sort of Crosshair and Tech are the most sort of they're the most meh to me. Wrecker to me is like extremely meh because he's just sort of like the idiot brute with the heart of gold, which is like there's nothing really clever about that. It's just this like, it's sort of just D. Bradley Baker doing like a really cartoonish sort of portrayal of adult, which like he does a great job, to be clear. Like that's the character. He does a great job with the character. It's just a very boring character. There's just nothing there for me. Crosshair at least has this arc, which we'll talk about, or it seems the makings of an arc. Tech is, again, he's literally just Tech. That's what he does. Echo is obviously the sort of the thing that makes this really interesting because he has a different history than the rest. He came in later. He's been different places, and I really hope that plays into where they go, and I hope that at some point they tap into the fact that he had a different experience of the Clone Wars than they did. But yeah, I agree that, it is... They have a lot of room to grow with this group of people, and some of them are definitely more interesting than others. But yeah, I mean, maybe we could talk about Omega and the fact that we don't know what her deal is either. We're 3 episodes in, and it's clear that there's something up with her besides just the fact that like she's Kaminoan property or whatever, and she got away. I am really interested to know like what's her deal, and I certainly hope it's not a Grogu type, Force thing. I hope it's a little bit more grounded than that, but there's a lot of possibilities for what that could be.
They're sort of verging into like the superhero genre with this show. X-Men. They're sort of mutants and they have special skills, and I feel like she's going to be sort of in the same boat in some way. Have y'all sensed any foreshadowing of what that could be specifically?
That's interesting. I have not picked up anything where it's like she has preternatural senses or she's super strong. Like I don't see that characteristic yet, and maybe it just hasn't had to come out yet. But that's an interesting theory because I don't see, and usually by now there would be some hint of what her deal is, and I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah. There was kind of a hint in the first episode where she tells Hunter, I think, not to blame Crosshair for what he does before Crosshair gets extra brainwashed. And she appears to know how to shoot very well, despite probably not having any training in that. And then in the third episode, she figures out what's going on with these creepy, teethy, bat-like creatures on this dark planet. So it seems like she perhaps is empathic in some way. And maybe that's her gift, as it were, but it hasn't really given us too many hints beyond that. Mostly, I think they've just been trying to establish the dynamic of they're dealing with a literal child, and they have to figure out how to be parents, essentially, to an 11-year-old or whatever, however old she is, who now basically is part of the team. So I think they're figuring out the family dynamic more right now, but there is definitely something weird going on with her.
Yeah, I just assumed that she knew how to fire a blaster because, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it sort of implied, especially based on the accent, that she is just a female clone from the Jango Fett template? That, like, she would, presumably be getting whatever sort of latent skills are in that DNA. But, even before the training, I think it's established that some of that is from the DNA, not from the training that comes after it. So I just assumed that was, like, something from, being a clone, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I will say, the accent, like, it's clear that Michelle Ng, the voice actress who voices Omega, is from New Zealand, and D. Bradley Baker is not. As much as I love D. Bradley Baker's voice, you just listen to Omega and you're like, oh, that's what a New Zealand accent is supposed to sound like. It's sort of funny because
she always calls herself Omega, like with the accent. Because
that's a New Zealand accent. But
other people just call her Omega. And it's like, if someone came up to me and said, my name's Omega, like, I would try to emulate that in some way,
But maybe they all know, like, oh, she's like from New Zealand. Yeah. Like, that's just how they pronounce it there. Like, yeah, I don't know. I just, like, I think it's also an open question. How much is she on the inside, or was she on the inside of what the Kaminoans were doing? Like, when she says, don't blame Crosshair, I assume that meant, like, she knows what they do to recalcitrant clones because she's been at the side of, I forget which Kaminoan it was, for however many years. I didn't necessarily think that was a sensing thing as much as just a knowledge thing.
Well, there's also, I think didn't she say she helped with like medical stuff? Like she was like a medical assistant or something.
Yeah.
So I sort of like Grace's theory that it's like some sort of empathic situation because, I don't know, just judging by how she sort of introduced herself to the group and recognized like these are my kind of people and sort of put herself into that situation. Like it sort of hints at like some broader knowledge. But then like maybe she'd just been watching them for a while and was familiar with them and wanted to be a part of the team and recognized that she was, the same way as they are.
Yeah, I have to imagine that if you work with the Kaminoans and you are regularly on the inside of that, you've probably heard of the Bad Batch. Like, my sort of headcanon is that they're sort of celebrity clones. Like, they get the hard missions, everybody knows who they are, and I could imagine someone like her being really interested in them because they're different, and she feels like she is different in some way. We also don't know if I have to imagine she's not the only, if she is a clone, I have to imagine she's not the only sort of female clone that they have around, as like a medical assistant or whatever, but maybe she is. Like, maybe she was, created for some special reason, if that's even what happened. So we don't know, like, what her place is in the society that she just left behind.
Maybe it's just me, but kind of pivoting off of what you were saying, Eric, I don't super love how this show treats the quote-unquote regular clones, like the regs.
Oh, it's so demeaning.
It's so demeaning. Okay, thank you.
Well, this is an oppressed class all on its own, right?
Yeah.
Like, you were created to go fight in battle and die, and you have like an accelerated aging, like it sucks to be a clone.
Right. And now to have the Bad Batch be like, they're regs, like, okay, just because you were genetically modified to have cool traits doesn't mean that the rest of the clones are worthless. And maybe, I'm being too sensitive because I love Echo, but it kind of seems like they're always asking Echo to, like, do the grunt work and being kind of mean to him when he, he's part robot, man. Give him a break. Don't just always ask him to be like your droid. And then also the other thing that I would say there is that it also kind of rings false to me that the regular clones would make fun of or alienate the Clone Batch 99, the Bad Batch, because like the way you said it, Eric, you'd think that these guys would be superheroes, and in their brief arc in the Clone Wars, like they seem to have kind of a reputation around the clones, the regular clones, where they're kind of held in awe. But it just seems kind of weird to me to spend 7 seasons of a previous show saying that just because they're clones, just because there are millions of them and they were all bred to die, it doesn't mean that they don't have value. And then suddenly turn around and be like, actually, those guys suck. And it's really these 5 ones that are genetically modified that are the real heroes here.
I sort of noticed that in, I think it was the first episode too, when they were in the cafeteria. Like, the animators went out of their way to make all of those clones look the exact same. Like, they all had the same haircuts. Like, you could not distinguish them. Whereas, like, in the Clone Wars, they all have individual identities. They have their own names for themselves. They have different hairstyles, so you can tell themselves apart. That's just seemed a little cheap to me.
I mean, these are the Kamino clones, right? So they may not yet have actually gone out into battle, and the only clones that we see with personalities and haircuts are the ones on the front line. So I don't necessarily take that as deliberate, or if it is, I think it's just in keeping with the idea that they are not yet fully formed people because they haven't been shaped by these experiences yet. I also think it's worth noting that the Bad Batch looks down on the regs, but the show is not telling you that you should look down on the regs. And I think that for the Bad Batch, it's a combination of insecurity about being sort of malformed, quote unquote, which is how their enhanced ability started, is that they were basically mutations. So there's some sort of defensiveness and a lack of self-confidence there. And then also, as we said, they are like really super powered. And even in the real world, where everybody is there are no superheroes, you do see, like, within the military, the Marines think that they're the best, and the Navy looks down on the Air Force. I mean, there are real tensions between the branches there, and some of them think that they're better, and they don't look pretty highly on the grunts in the infantry. And that, to me, makes a lot of sense, that if you were in the Bad Batch, you would, for a combination of those two factors, you would make fun of the regs. It doesn't mean that you think they're actually worth less than you, but you and the regs are coming at this from the perspective of, we were created to be thrown away. So you have that solidarity there, but within that, it makes perfect sense to me that some of these people would think, those are just the ones that get the regular treatment, whereas we're the ones who had to go through something. I'm doing my D. Bradley Baker impression here.
Tell. I can hear it.
All right, I'll stop there, but it makes perfect sense to me. I don't take it as the show beating up on the clones or being inconsistent with the 7 seasons of the Clone Wars. I think this is what these characters would do in this situation.
Well, I'm just a total dweeb and I'm very sensitive to people being mean to other people. I'm like, that seems unnecessary. I think they're telling a story of, especially if they were bullied by other clones and, the tensions there. That's sort of how it ends up for a lot of people. But I like everybody to be friends.
I guess also for me, because I love the clones so much, and then having the emotional gut punch of Order 66, and that's part of what makes the Clone Wars TV show such a wonderful show and like such a delicious tragedy, is that all of these characters that you've grown to know and love as individuals, at the end they ultimately never had any free will at all, and that's hurts because that they were individuals even if they weren't created to be that way. So even I understand why the show, it's not focused on the regular clones, it's focused on the Bad Batch and would show things from their perspective. But given that the clones kind of already were made one-dimensional within the story by the Empire and Sidious, it's just kind of a bummer to me to see them be treated as one-dimensional by their fellow clones as well. So,
well, and we obviously do want to talk about one of the cool things about this show, which is recruits versus clones and the sort of dying breed of the clone trooper. And this is a period of time that fans have really wanted to see for a long time in terms of how do you get stormtroopers. But you mentioned Order 66. Do you want to jump very quickly to, I think, the reason why you didn't like that first episode and the sort of the retcon, frankly, of the original depiction of Order 66 for Kanan, because we do see Kanan in the first episode, but it plays out differently than it did in the comic series.
So I'll just say, for me and probably some of our listeners, we have not read the comic. I think it's okay to do some spoilers if we give a little warning. Like, can you just summarize the main differences there?
Eric, why don't you go ahead and do that?
So I'm actually Googling it because all I remember that's different is obviously the Bad Batch aren't there. There's a moment where Kanan, I think, is just sitting there with his master. It's like nighttime and they're sitting around a fire or something, and then the order gets executed. And I don't remember the exact depiction, but the long and the short of it is basically it doesn't involve the Bad Batch. They're not there watching. They don't get involved. The thing that's consistent is that Kanan's master does defend herself against the clones to buy Kanan time to get away, but it's depicted differently. And it's, we saw this with in the Clone Wars. There was a Jedi Master named Even Peel who had been killed in a book, although not a canon book. So this is a little bit different. But then he was killed in the TV show in a different way, and that prompted all these questions about Is the show going to be changing things that we already know? And that conversation was different because, again, that was not a canon book. But now we've had multiple years of the Disney canon. Authors have been invited to tell stories and being, tacitly given that sort of imprimatur of this is the way that it actually happened. You get to tell the way that it actually happened. And then Dave Filoni comes along and tells it the way that it actually happened.
Well, so I actually will go into a little more detail then about the difference between the comics and
Thank you, because I actually
Bad
don't
Batch.
remember the specifics.
So I mean, it's been a few months since I've read it, so I don't super remember the specifics, but what I really loved about the comics is, first of all, it showed the relationship, but not only between baby Caleb and his master, Depa Billaba, but also between Caleb and the clones. So there are these two clones in particular who really take Caleb under their wing, and they kind of really forge a close bond, and Caleb begins to think of them as brothers. So I can understand why that context couldn't be included in a TV show. But the change that I really didn't like was in the comics, when Order 66 comes through, Caleb actually helps his master fight the clones for a while. And it's just this wrenching moment of him having to kill these people, these soldiers that he's fought with, that he thought of as brothers. And you kind of see his inner monologue as he's being forced to defend himself against these people. Like when he kills one of the stormtroopers, he thinks, we had just gotten a Melu Run fruit together the other day, and now here I am killing him. So it's a really powerful moment to suddenly see him fighting these people that he has a very close connection with and not know why. And so he then, after they've been fighting for a while, they get overwhelmed and his master tells him to run. And she also gets a few more lines when she's telling him to run that are really meaningful too. Like she says, I'll be right behind you. And he knows that she won't be right behind him. But he still goes anyway. So it's just, the focus is on Kanan, and in the show, the focus is not on Kanan, because it's not a Kanan show. And it just kind of flattened his backstory in a way that I didn't like, because in the show, he's not present when Order 66 is called. He's walking away with the Bad Batch, and Depa Billaba begins fighting alone. So he's not part of that fight. And then also in the comic, he basically just kind of has to figure out how to escape by himself. And he's still being hunted down by the two clones that he became close friends with. Whereas in the Bad Batch, I mean, he does get away with the help of Hunter. So, I mean, like I said, I understand why they changed it because it's not the Kanan show. But I think it really did a disservice to an already cool and complex backstory that they had, and just was ultimately unnecessary. Like, they didn't have to do that. They could have chosen any other Jedi to demonstrate what Order 66 was, and they just unnecessarily messed with what was supposedly canon for no real good reason. Also, they should have tuned up Freddie Prinze Jr.'s voice.
Oh my gosh.
Well, yes. And by the way, the Lucasfilm explanation is we didn't change anything. This is just one interpretation, one telling of a story that has been told by many different people from many perspectives. And my response to that is, if you're like so Pablo Hidalgo, who is a member of the Lucasfilm Story Group, who's used to be very active on Twitter and now was basically harassed into making his account private, basically said like what happened is Order 66 was issued and it affected Kanan Jarrus. Now these two different stories tell the specifics of that in different ways, but that is the canon fact. And my response to that would be, why draw the line where you drew it? Like, you arbitrarily draw the line at, like, those are the two things that happened. Order 66 happened. Kanan Jarrus was affected by it. Like, you're putting that line there of what's canon and what is an interpretation in a very arbitrary place. And you don't get to market and sort of publicize this idea of a shared universe where everybody's working hand in hand together to enrich stories that are told in one place by telling a different another shade of them in another place. You don't get to do that if your argument is, well, we're not actually telling you what really happened. We're just showing you different people, you know, creating what they imagine might have happened. Like, that's not a shared universe at that point. That is multiple people writing fan fiction about the same characters. Like, that's not a shared universe.
Yeah.
You know, you can't market it as the same thing being told from different perspectives and in different mediums if you're actually saying that it isn't the same thing. It's different people's versions of that thing.
I think there's room for, you know, unreliable narrators and, like, slight discrepancies in things like this.
For sure.
Because I think it can make things interesting. But, I mean, from what you guys are describing, that's very different just in terms of who was hunting him down and, you know, what he did during that moment. So, I mean, I'm not super attached to the comics, but that does seem sort of unnecessary.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that I'm totally down with unreliable narrators. It's one of my favorite literary devices. And that's not the problem. The problem is that it was an unnecessary thing to do, and that then they defended it pretty poorly.
And also, there was nothing unreliable about this. Like, this would be, like, to use the journalistic term, like the voice of God, where you're not citing it to somebody who's sharing their view. You're saying, as the authoritative source in the story, like, this is what happened. Like, it's not, if it were a book where, you know, Hunter was the narrator of the book, and he says, you know, from my perspective, you know, it looked an awful lot like this happened, and, you know, well, he could have just seen it wrong, right? So the book has things going this way, but the book is based on what Hunter perceives, and Hunter could have a flawed perception. Like, that's an unreliable narrator. That's fine. That's a great way to tell the story differently while making it clear to the audience that he probably didn't actually see what happened. This is just what he thinks happened. When you're showing it on a TV show where there's a camera, you know, there documenting it in a sense, that's what actually happened. There's nothing unreliable about that. So there's, you know, I find that, you know, frustrating. And of course, that gets into another issue, which is the whitewashing of both Kanan and the clones, who, if you look at them in this TV show, they are very light-skinned for people who, at least in the case of the clones, are supposed to be Maori, you know, of Maori descent, essentially.
Yeah, for me, it was, I mean, for a couple of those clones, like, Echo just looks like he's been dead for a week. So, that doesn't.
Well, yeah, he went through a lot as a prisoner.
He's been through it. He's been
through it. The one clone who bothers me is Tech. Like, that's just a white man. Like. But more than, like, the Bad Batch didn't bother me as much as, I mean, Caleb does not look that way in Rebels. Like, he looked like a ginger, and just like a pale child. And
pasty.
Very pasty. I saw some people, you know, sort of say he looked like Cal Kestis instead of Kanan, which, I mean, is pretty accurate. So I don't know why they did that.
Yeah, so the thing about the clones is that they are based on a real actor, Tamora Morrison, who is of Maori descent, is from New Zealand, and he has appeared in The Mandalorian recently as Boba Fett, and as part of The Mandalorian, he incorporated some Maori styles of fighting into Boba's fighting. So we know that the clone template is supposed to be of Maori descent, and also just in the larger context that's important to the actor himself. So that makes that aspect problematic because, as you said, Haley, it's more apparent with, like, Tech and Crosshair than it is with Hunter and Wrecker, or the quote-unquote regular clones. But it's not just the skin color, but also the way they've changed their faces. So Tech and Crosshair both have narrower noses, which some fans have pointed out. So that's just on its surface problematic. And then the Kanan thing, so unlike the clones, Kanan is not based on a real actor, but he's not a white guy in the way that Baby Caleb, as portrayed in The Bad Batch, is. Like, Baby Caleb looks like he could be my brother, and I'm white as hell. like white redhead. That's not what Kanan in the show Rebels is. And I've heard, some people on the internet give excuses like, well, it was the lighting.
Right, it was the camera lens that they chose to use for the filming of that episode.
And that's, I mean, come on, that's a dumb excuse.
Well, for me, it's like they pulled him into this show specifically for, people who had watched Rebels and to, like, have that tie-in. And it was like, when you initially see that child, it's like that, I don't know who that kid, like, there's no, like, resonance there until it's like, oh, clearly that's his old master, and, like, she's calling him Caleb. Like, you have to put the pieces together, because it just did not look like him.
And again, it's just an unnecessary thing. And, like, at best, was just very careless of them to, I mean, it kind of makes it seem as if they don't really care about the character at all if they're, first of all, messing with his already canon backstory, and then second of all, like, not making him look in the slightest like what he would grow up to be. So at best, they were just careless. And that's not where you want to be. You want to, actually put thought into a character. And it just seems to me that if they were doing so much work to make the animation as beautiful as it is, the least you could do, like the actual least, would be to look at what the character is supposed to look like as a grown-up and, make sure that's reflected as a child. That bar is on the floor, and yet somehow they did not go above it.
It's weird because, like, they are known for their attention to detail in general and for the care that they put into especially the animation, which I would argue is, along with sound design, probably the area where this stands out the most from other TV shows. Like, forget about the story. If you're a Star Wars fan, you care about the story. If you're not, you may not care about the story. But you can't look at this and deny that it is some of the highest quality animation on television, full stop, as I said at the beginning. So this was a rare oversight for them, and hopefully it doesn't happen again.
I saw something, IO9 reported that Lucasfilm saw all the whitewashing controversy and was like, it was a lighting issue, we'll fix it in future episodes. So I hope, I still think that's a BS excuse, but I hope they, take the time to actually learn from this and listen to the fans who expressed a lot of correct anger about it, because just in general, people of color who are fans tend not to be listened to as much as white fans, and I'm really hoping that this shouldn't have happened in the first place, but since it did happen, maybe it can be a teachable moment for Lucasfilm to be like, you have this responsibility. You have gorgeous animation. Now, how about you actually remain accurate, instead of, like I said, at best being very careless.
Yeah, I'm also like a lighting truther. I don't buy that explanation, so I would like to, I would like to see this fixed. One of the things that drew me to the show from the beginning was the time period, and I think we're already seeing them do a lot of great stuff playing off of the time period. And we alluded to this earlier, but it's so fascinating to watch this sort of canonical depiction of how does the Empire solidify? What sort of bureaucratic processes do they put in place to tighten their grip on the citizenry. It's not just building Star Destroyers. It's also, as we see in the show, making every citizen register for an ID number and planning the future of the Army based around the idea that we want loyalty more so than competence. There's this great conversation that Tarkin has, and so Tarkin's back, so that's cool. And he talks to the Kaminoans about basically, yeah, these people are highly trained, but like we could probably train recruits just as well, and they would be fanatically loyal to us because they're self-selecting, right? They're joining up. There's, I guess, that separate question of conscription, which I think is a thing in the Empire, although I don't know how widespread it is. But at this point, they're talking about recruits. What did you think about the way that we see the Empire sort of starting to take shape after, like, oh crap, like we won. Like, not only do we win, but like Palpatine, like, just sort of reformed us as like a fascist, galactic government. We got to figure out how to actually implement that.
Yeah. And I thought it was funny in that scene where Tarkin is talking about the benefits of, just hiring regular people. And like, man, that was a fatal error. Like, they really lost a lot of their competence, and like, it does explain a lot of, why the stormtroopers are so terrible. But I mean, I think it's also interesting to, it sort of ties in what we see later in Rebels when the clones who were with the Empire have sort of left or were kicked out in different ways, and they're sort of bitter about it, and Rex at some point makes jokes about the armor is cheap now, and like the stormtroopers can't shoot things. It's just like decline. Like they clearly, Tarkin did not think through some of the efficiency and effectiveness things that they were going to lose.
I will say my favorite part of the Bad Batch and what keeps me coming to it is the time period, because like you said, Eric, this has long been a subject of interest for Star Wars fans. So I think the time period is really fun. I mean, I would have preferred to be following, Kanan or even Rex than the Bad Batch, but the Bad Batch is who we have. Therefore, I will follow them and keep watching it. But I do think that the most interesting aspects of the show are looking at how the Empire becomes kind of a cohesive entity, and seeing, like Haley said, kind of the flaws being built in from the very beginning. I think that's really fun. And I do think the idea of recruits joining the Empire is pretty interesting, because you're right, they'd be self-selecting. They would be the most dedicated to the cause. But then seeing how going forward, the Empire basically is just the only option. So instead of having recruits who are really zealots and dedicated to the cause, eventually you're just going to get people who are like, well, this is it for me. I have no other choice in life. And that's how you get your poorly shooting stormtroopers. But I think that's fun. I think that is something that is genuinely well done in this show, and that is my personal favorite aspect of it, other than co-parenting a child.
And
oh, go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say quickly, the other thing that's interesting is when Crosshair takes the recruits on that first mission.
Yeah.
They're not ready to go all the way yet, and so at this stage, maybe that was just one particular group of recruits, but like some of these people are joining up to serve the government, law and order, all that stuff, but they are not bloodthirsty. They are not cold-blooded killers. And it's the clone who is basically like, I forget the expression, but it's like there's no one as passionate as a convert, right? He is part of this new order now, pun intended, and he's like, all right, I'm going to do the mission. Like they want recruits.
War crimes.
Right, exactly. Like my people are on the way out. They're bringing in the recruits. So I got to show that I can keep up. And it ends with him basically saying, look, you guys need to be ready to commit war crimes because otherwise you're not going to do well in this empire. And I think, I want to keep following that squad because I want to see, are we watching how people who sign up to do what they think is a good, morally defensible thing become corrupted by the system to the point where they are, killing civilians with wild abandon and becoming what we know of as the caricatured bad guy, henchmen, stormtroopers. What we're seeing here is they didn't necessarily all start that way.
I think one thing, too, is that, if you're going to start having your soldiers do terrible things like this on a regular basis where they're killing civilians and things like that's another situation in which maybe clones who have brain chips that make them obey, like maybe that would be better than the recruits. Because, I mean, as we've seen in other, different Star Wars stories, like these stormtroopers really do struggle with some of those moral deliberations and they can sort of delude themselves into thinking, oh, it's for a greater cause and, those sorts of justifications. But, you have people who ultimately do sort of defect to the rebellion. And, it's fine if it's just a few, right? But over time, if it's building and it can sort of chip away at, intelligence capabilities, they're bringing information over to the rebellion. But it also, gives them more manpower. So, I mean, that's another reason that sticking with the clones maybe would have been worth the financial investment. Because all of a sudden they're worried about the money it costs to have the clones.
Right, and presumably, like, they've just, like, nationalized a lot of, like, shipyards and other industries, so they don't have to, like, pay as much for that anymore. So, like, why are they so worried about, like... first of all, like, why haven't they nationalized the cloning industry as well? Because I think this is definitely in the old continuity, but I think it's also true in canon that, like, the Empire just straight up took over a lot of production stuff and, like, didn't pay anymore. They paid for the upkeep and the actual work, but they didn't pay fees as if it was a private company anymore. So I think it's kind of weird that this is, like, a money issue, given that it would seem like one of the best parts about being, like, a fascist galactic government is you can just take the money.
Yeah, I think this is one of those examples of, them having to find an excuse for the story to go where it goes. So we have clones, presumably by the time the original trilogy rolls around, most of the stormtroopers aren't clones. How did we get there? And so this show is having to create the explanation of how we got there. And in order to follow that explanation, you have to suspend your disbelief on some things. And I think that's just an example where you have to realize, like, yeah, no, it doesn't make as much sense, but because this is how things have to be, I will follow this narrative thread. So that doesn't bother me as much as it could, because I've just kind of given up. Like, yeah, okay, sure, this is how it goes. Fine, whatever. We'll follow that.
And I guess you could say that clones like Cut, who choose to desert and do their own thing, or the Bad Batch, frankly, who just because of some error, their chips don't go off. Like, those are pretty great examples, especially Cut, of maybe we do want people who bring loyalty more than competence, because if we don't have loyalty, it doesn't matter how competent they are, and in fact, their competence could be a double-edged sword. So that would be my devil's advocate argument.
I love Cut. I loved the inclusion of Cut and Sue and their cute little family in the second episode. Fun. I went from being a hard Bad Batch skeptic after the first episode to being a milder Bad Batch skeptic, and that is solely because of Cut and Sue and that fun little side story. So big fan of that. Loved that throwback.
Yeah, it was nice to see them again. And it's another example of, like, I think a lot of people probably assumed, like, that was just a one-off thing. It was like a morality tale in Clone Wars about how, like, some clones don't toe the party line. But this just shows, like, one of the best things about this whole franchise, frankly, is there are always things like that you can pick back up if you want to hit on a theme like this. And the galaxy's big enough that, sure, you can have them cross paths with these people. You can find a reason to make this work. And perhaps unlike what we were talking about earlier with the recruits versus clones thing, in this case, it didn't feel shoehorned. It made sense that they would want to talk to one of the only clones that they knew who was not still part of the system.
Yeah, and this is a minor thing, but I also like to return to that story because Sue cuts Twi'lek wife / partner in the initial episode that they're introduced in Clone Wars. She's wearing an unnecessarily sexy Twi'lek outfit.
Oh, it was ridiculous.
It was just ridiculous. And this episode, she's wearing a very practical outfit. She is respected as a good sharpshooter.
I'm glad you noticed that too, Grace.
Yeah,
I was like, look, she's
I
wearing clothes.
noticed that. She's wearing normal clothes, as it should be. And I just personally appreciated the kind of reclamation of a female character from, instead of being like a token love interest, even if it wasn't a one-off episode, to being a fully developed character who's like a mother and a hunter and helps teach the character Hunter to be a good dad. And I just appreciated kind of righting that wrong from 10 years ago or 12 years ago or whatever.
Did she have the French accent that all Twi'leks have?
She did.
Okay, good. So they got that right as well.
Every Twi'lek except Hera.
Well, but they explained that. She got rid of it consciously.
She did. No, they explain it, but I still think it's funny.
I also think it's like, at some point they realize, like, oh crap, like Vanessa Marshall's gonna have to do a French accent for like 8 seasons, and then they're like, nope, we're just gonna explain that she didn't want to sound like she was from Ryloth anymore. All right, is there anything that we haven't hit on that we should get to before we punch out of here?
Yes, I wanted you to discuss which Bad Batch character you most identify with.
Oh, right. So I mean, I'm obviously Tech. I'm obviously
you even
Tech.
look like Tech.
I first of all, I look like Tech. I am about as fun at a party as Tech probably is, but I am probably just as likely to be able to fix your like Windows Vista like bug as Tech is. So
only you would be called Cyber.
Yeah, that's right, Cyber, or like Cyborg or something like that.
No, Cyber.
By the way, this is a side jag, but one of my favorite things about the last season of Clone Wars was actually, it was in the Bad Batch arc. They had to raid a separatist cyber center, and I don't understand why they called it a cyber center. I think they just wanted to be like, ooh, it's technology. But like, love that. Love that they said cyber like 100 times.
Yeah, that's your thing.
Yeah.
For me, I don't actually know which Bad Batch I would be. I like Hunter the best. So maybe I'd be him. I also like wearing bandanas around my hair. So that's
really the only qualification you need. Yeah.
I wouldn't get a face tattoo, but I understand the urge. Ooh, I do love knives. So that definitely
we won't ask any questions about that one. We'll just move right on from that one.
So, okay, I'm Hunter, and specifically his knives.
I have no idea which one I am. I enjoy Wrecker the most, just because he's seems very wholesome. But I mean, I don't know that much about Crosshair, except that he's
a jerk.
Clearly very moody, has some issues. I could find myself relating to Crosshair a little bit, but not in the fascist evil way that he has displayed his character this season. But
well, if Grace is Hunter's knives specifically, are you Crosshair's toothpick?
No, okay. I do not want to be that.
Well, I think, Haley, you have a pure soul, and Crosshair was depicted as a jerk even when he appeared in the Clone Wars. Like,
Yeah, see, I don't remember, so I
in
feel
that
like I
arc-
should go back and watch it.
in that arc, he was a jerk for absolutely no reason. So
What
you're
did he
not
do?
Crosshair. He was just, acting mean.
Is he
For
the one
no
who tried to
reason.
start stuff with
Yeah, he's the
Rex?
one who tried to start stuff with Rex.
And Anakin had to, like, pull them apart.
Yeah.
Oh, that's just, I wouldn't do
unnecessary.
that.
How could you do that to Rex?
There's no disagreements necessary here, so.
So I think, Haley, that maybe you're most like Omega.
I was going to
Omega.
say, I think Haley is the one who's like, oh, clone troopers, this is cool. What's going on here?
Haley, she's the chipper one who's super curious and, brings
Well,
people
thank you.
together with her warmth. Haley just made me cupcakes, so I'm extra,
Well,
emotional
for the
about
record,
Haley
I don't
now.
want to steal the cupcake valor. My husband made the cupcake.
Yes,
I
Haley's
delivered
husband made the
cupcake.
cupcakes.
Wait, so, all right. So am I to understand that there's been a Hoth Takes co-host cupcake exchange that I wasn't invited to?
Yeah, it was when we canceled the recording the other day. I was like, "Do you want some cupcakes?"
Oh,
I did
wow.
want some cupcakes. So,
Sorry,
Anyway.
Eric.
Well, next time maybe like make some for me and put like icing on it that says like Hoth cakes.
no. I think the icing for
The icing
us
was a-
should say Hoth cakes, but the icing for Eric should say Cyber.
Like,
Oh yeah.
that's
I like it.
perfect.
All right, we're going to leave it there for this episode. We'll obviously be continuing to talk about the Bad Batch as the episodes air. But, I think that's about everything we have to say for these episodes. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you want to share your thoughts about this episode or suggest topics for future shows, you can email us at hothtakes@gmail.com or find us on Twitter @hothtakes. You can follow us individually on Twitter as well. I'm @Eric Geller. Grace is @Grace_Seegers. Haley is @Birdinator. Haley made our logo and our banner art, and I edited the show and put together our music. Although, for legal purposes, we do want to point out all Star Wars themes and sound effects do remain the intellectual property of Lucasfilm. You can find a complete archive of past episodes on our website, hothtakes.wordpress.com, and if you like the show, share it with a friend. Just tell them to subscribe on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher. Okay, we'll see you next time. May the Force be with you.